Good morning. This is the third section in class, or I should say, subphylum Vertebrata, where we are talking about class Amphibia. And of course, this involves frogs, salamanders, and toads, and some things that don't look quite like a salamander or a toad, but that's okay. Of course, since they go in between water and land, they are considered probably the link evolutionarily to terrestrial animals, mostly because they actually walk on land or travel on land and can live in the water. On top of that, this is the first time we have an addition of a lung. Some of these also have gills, and most of them breathe through their skin at some time or the other. So we have what would logically be an evolutionary link at a macro scale. However, there is a lot of metabolic changes, genetic and tissue coordination changes that are needed for this. You have to reroute your blood system, not only to your skin, but to these sacs inside that are definitely not gills. You need to have a whole behavioral change. You have to have uh, an excretion pattern change as well. It's there is a large change. Now, they still breathe through their skin. They have that cold, moist skin to help exchange CO2 with oxygen. It just makes sense because that's its largest surface area. Its lungs are not branched or anything like that. They're basically big water balloons or slightly large water balloons with very little surface area on the inside, but they have blood vessels all around it. So when we're looking at this phylogeny tree, we have vertebrates and then lacking jaws. We have cartilage-based fish. We have bony fish. And then we also now have limbs. So amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, hopefully, hold on, wait for it, all have limbs for the most part. So they're collected in this group. Now, amphibia, you can always argue, breathes through their skin. That's one of their major characteristics that are different than reptiles, birds, and mammals. When we think about this, first of all, we have to start thinking about eggs. Up until this point, we didn't have to worry about having water on the eggs because everything was in water. Now we have to worry about keeping water on the eggs. And in this case, we don't need to keep water on the eggs because they're still involved with water. But the next group is not, FYI. Now, we start getting into more complicated hearts. Before this, we had a filling chamber and a pumping chamber, and that's it. Now we're getting into chambered hearts. We have valves to keep it from backflowing. And a three-chambered heart is very odd. And I'll talk about that later on because you have two filling uh, chambers, a left and right ventricle, and then one pumping chamber. So think about that. Percolate it, mull it over while I'm talking about other things uh, on how oxygen and oxygenated and non-oxygenated blood might mix, lowering its effectiveness as being pumped. So basically, they have this alternation and generation as well. The young are only in the water and basically feed on small plankton and such like that. And the adults will be carnivores, or in this case, insectivores. There's a large group of them. We have, of course, the tree frog, which is common to this area. We have something that does not look like anything in the amphibian group, but it actually is an amphibian. It has small, tiny, tiny legs sometimes. And then, of course, the characteristic barred salamander. Or tiger salamander. I have never found a salamander in the Wisconsin area. Apparently, I'm not looking easily or well, but I would love to find one. I like salamanders, they're pretty cool. If you have never been in kindergarten, watched Sesame Street, or had science in uh, K through 8, you need to know that there is an alternation generation in amphibians. They start as an egg, they get into this tadpole stage, they start developing legs, which looks like a very awkward childhood or teenage years, and then develop into adults. Sometimes this is in a course of 3 months, sometimes it is longer. But in most freshwater ponds, about a month or so, you'll see a whole cloud of these little uh, black things swimming around, and they're actually cute, and you can catch them and take a look at them, and then gently release them back in the water. They have a postanal tail, they have a notochord, and they have gills. As well, or pharyngeal slits, I should say, that are functional as gills. Then later on, they don't have gills. Here's the reduction of that postanal tail, and afterwards they don't have it. So we have this alternation generation, but they fit all the characteristics of the chordates, phylum Chordata, and vertebrata. So about this time in swamps and in waterways, you'll hear the peeping of frogs, spring peepers, bullfrogs, such like that. They are calling to mate. And what they'll do is produce a lot of eggs and either let them go and live their best life without children, or um, sometimes will have care by the parents for their young and increase their survival or fitness, and more of them will survive to adulthood. So these eggs develop into this embryo tadpole, and then development into an adult. With bullfrogs, this can take a number of years. I love talking about frogs. It's fun, but we need to move on to another class. And we can uh, compare these two, which is class Reptilia. Basically, some of them look very similar, but they now have dry skin. They do not absorb oxygen through their skin very well at all. There is some taken up through their skin, but very, very reduced compared to amphibia. So they have to rely mostly on their lungs, and their lungs are more developed. Uh, Less just water balloon and a little bit more folding, a lot more blood vessels around it. Now we have to worry about eggs drying out. So we have this leathery covering that will hold in water now that they're completely on land. So we have what we call amniotic eggs, and I'll show you a picture later on of what that means, and having this leathery coating to keep uh, water on the egg without losing it when you exchange oxygen. Now, we take a large step from the class amphibia to a four-chambered heart, or at least a incomplete four-chambered heart. But this also means that we will have restructuring of the blood vessels. And I'll show you what this incomplete means. It means it almost has a full septum, dividing this into two pumping chambers. And on top of that, we have a metabolic control called ectothermic control, which is basically using the environment as well as a minor amount of the thymus to control its metabolic output, heat, in other words. But most of these will tie into a human behavior, or not a human animal behavior, where they can control their heat by being out in the sun, basking, or hiding underneath a rock, and reducing their input of heat. Now, with this egg, basically it keeps the water in. The Basically, like a mimic of a placenta, it'll take up food and water from one area, and then it'll dump off its nitrogenous waste into another area of the egg. And it also has an oxygen exchange area of the egg, kind of like placenta. So it has everything it needs inside this casing. Here is a characteristic picture from the National Science Foundation, unfortunately, showing the different chambers of hearts. And here is the frog, where it has a filling chamber for the deoxygenated blood, shown in blue. The purple is a mix of the oxygenated blood with the deoxygenated blood. We have the reptiles where we have the septum, so it's an incomplete four-chambered heart. And you notice the purple color, I'll get back to that, showing that when it pumps out, there is a mix of oxygenated blood with deoxygenated blood. And then the best of all animals, apparently, birds and mammals, where you have a full septum, where it is the deoxygenated blood pumped to the lungs. The lungs bring back this deoxygen, or the pulmonary vein brings back the oxygenated blood, and that's pumped out to the body. So our body gets the best, most perfect blood that's oxygenated to the highest. It turns out these two were actually wrong. There has been recent radioactivity measurements showing that, and sensors put, very fine sensors put in the blood vessels coming out, like the brachiocephalic trunk and things like that, showing that this blood for the amphibian, the deoxygenated and the oxygenated blood, actually don't mix in one single chamber as it's being pumped out. Turns out one compression of this uh, ventricle will pump the deoxygenated blood one way and the oxygenated blood another way without very much mixing at all. So this picture showing this purple mixed blood, mostly blue, is actually incorrect. They do have ability to survive deoxygenated blood and oxygen starved tissues much better than ours, but it is not like this. For the second one, showing that there's a gap here, the same thing occurs where the oxygenated blood gets pumped a different way, even though this is an open chamber. People, hydraulic engineers and bioengineers have been studying how they control the flow of this blood in order to better treat um, issues with the heart valve, and possibly look at different ways to make biomimicry occur. So I just point this out because this paper annoys me, or something coming from the National Science Foundation. It is actually incorrect, and sometimes our actual books will talk about it this way, and it is not as inefficient as they suggest. So, when we're talking about kidneys, we have a new problem. Since we're on land, we actually need to keep our water in us. So, now we need to have really efficient filtering and concentration of our nitric, or nitrogen byproducts. So we do not have ammonia that much anymore in our byproducts, and even urea is not enough for these scaly animals. They will secrete uric acid, which is a white paste that you usually see with birds as well. This will concentrate down, so they are losing the least amount of water possible. Now, this kidney or nephron unit doesn't look as developed as ours, but it has a glomerulus where the plasma is squeezed out. It then brings up all the good things and returns that from the interior surface into the portal vein, and then retains and pulls back the water. So at the end, we basically have a semi-solid paste, and more of it's pulled out in the cloaca, that shared sewer between the reproductive organs, the kidney, and the rectum. So please remember that the uric acid is the most concentrated, the most easily concentrated, um and it takes the most energy to produce. So, one thing to remember about the birds, reptiles, and mammals is that they all have an amniotic sac, but the reptiles will have this uh, leathery covering. They also have produce uric acid, but so do the birds. So they have this cloaca and are have a dry, scaly skin. That's probably the best way to remember it. Now, that being said, I'm going to show you a picture of a sea turtle. They are awesome to see up close. I was within probably about 2 feet of one at one point. I got to see one sleeping on the bottom of the seafloor by a large barrel sponge. It was an incredible experience. So we have sea turtles. They can swim rather fast. If they are booking it, there is no possibility of catching up with them. We also have Gila monsters in the exact opposite environment where it's very dry, south west deserts. They have a poison gland and they store liquids and nutrients in their tails. They have a patterning that warns everybody off because they're not a good thing to run into. But they keep to themselves. They don't go out hunting you. And then we have the totora, which is basically a scaly lizard, which is what we usually think about when we think about reptiles. Now, here's a picture of their amniotic sac. This is one where, well, crocodiles will use it, of course. It's a leathery outside, and then it has an air space, so it exchanges air with the outside. So if there isn't a buildup of CO2 here, it exchanges it with the outside without losing water. It has different areas of this egg. And here's the developing embryo. It has an area just to pick up um, food from this yolk sac where all the food is. And then it also has this blood system, like a secondary placenta, to drop off nitrogen products as well as take up oxygen, uh, basically into this air sac here. And then the blood system is split up in a very complicated way into two different areas. And you can appreciate this as the mammals will have only one exterior blood system coming out. Of course, when we're talking about orders inside this class, Crocodilla, which is crocodiles, alligators, and caimans, we have some Egyptian alligators, Egyptian crocodiles actually, that are smaller, that are in our reptile house at the Milwaukee Zoo, which is an excellent place to go look at reptiles. They have a really good reptile house. We have the Chelonia, which are the hawksbill sea turtle, again, one that I saw. And the dive shop in Grenada has a nesting ground that is right outside their shop. And every year when we went, we literally walked over that part where apparently a sea turtle had laid eggs, and the baby sea turtles would pop out of that ground and go to the ocean really quickly. It was a very unusual thing, and we always miss it, but I would love to see it. Now, the squamata are the area where everybody has problems. This is a completely harmless snake. It actually fakes death a lot of the time, puts out a smell, and goes into this coma-like state to pretend it's dead, because a lot of predators will not eat dead or rank-smelling things. But a hognose snake. There are a lot of snakes that are very good for the environment and the ecological cycling, and a number of other reptiles, like my bearded dragon, that are harmless. Um, so many of us have a fairly irrational fear of it. I personally do not like the thought of being bit by a venomous snake, but it hasn't ever really happened, so it's really a paranoia at this point. I think we'll stop there and go into the class AVs next.